After coming out of the sea, today Tom Hanks is in the air. Our movie kicks off with Captain Sully flying the plane, cruising safely, but just moments later, he's hit with a failure in the main engines. The plane's on the verge of crashing. Since the plane's flying over New York City, it's headed straight toward a building. But Sully manages to avoid the collision just in time. Unfortunately for them, New York is packed with skyscrapers and the plane crashes into another building and explodes. Then, we realize this intense sequence was just a nightmare. Sully wakes up in a panic, drenched in fear. We notice on the news channels a story about a successful emergency landing of a plane in the Hudson River. We find out that Captain Sully was the one piloting the plane, saving the lives of 155 passengers on board. Sully has an appointment with his friend and co-pilot Jeff, because both of them are being investigated over the incident. The committee in charge describes the event as an accident, but Sully disagrees. In his view, it was an emergency landing, and he explains that he knew exactly what he was doing. The investigators ask him why he chose to land in the river, suggesting that it would have been better to land at the nearest airport. Sully explains that their altitude wouldn't have allowed them to reach any nearby airport safely. Unfortunately, the investigation doesn't go the way Sully expects. Things get worse for him, and he's blamed for the loss of the plane. After the investigation, Sully and Jeff are in a taxi on their way back. They find that even the taxi driver is impressed by Sully's heroic action. On the way, Sully gets a call from his wife, Lauren, telling him that she's worried and feeling a lot of pressure because of the journalists surrounding their house. Sully arrives at the hotel and he finds dozens of journalists gathered around asking him about the incident and his role in saving the passengers. Sully doesn't pay much attention to the reporters. He heads up to his room to call his wife, telling her that he's also feeling the pressure from the investigations. Even Jeff is feeling the stress, and honestly, I'm stressed. The viewers are stressed. We all wish we could escape to a remote island and make friends with a volleyball. Sully and Jeff decide to take a walk to clear their heads and get out of the mental rut they're in. On the way, they talk about how they'll handle their media appearance the next day. Sully feels deeply upset because, despite his years of flying experience, he's being judged for a decision he made in mere seconds. But Jeff reassures him, reminding him that he saved hundreds of lives and made the right call. The next day, Sully does the interview with reporter Katie, who asks him how it feels to be a national hero. He responds, saying he's not a hero, he was just doing his job, nothing more, nothing less. We can see the weight of the pressure on Sully, to the point where he starts hallucinating, seeing planes crashing in the city. The following day, during the investigation, Charles, the head of the inquiry, arrives and tells them that one of the engines wasn't actually malfunctioning. It was just slow, nothing more. It was proven that they could have turned back to the airport and didn't have to land in the river. But Sully denies it, insisting that he felt both engines were failing, even though there's no evidence to back up his claim. Charles accuses Sully of putting the passengers' lives in danger, saying that his mistake damaged the airline's reputation. That night, Sully returns to the hotel and calls his wife for support, hoping she'll ease his mind. But instead, she adds to the pressure, telling him that their financial situation has gotten bad and that he needs to get back to work as soon as possible. Sully is terrified that the investigators' claims might be true, and that what happened was just a judgment error on his part. If that's the case, his life will become a nightmare. We then flash back to the day of the incident, January 15, 2009. Sully is preparing as usual and heads toward the plane with his friend Jeff. They do their preliminary checks before takeoff. A few minutes after takeoff, they're startled to see a flock of birds heading straight for them, and they can't avoid them. The birds hit both engines, causing them to explode and stop working. The passengers are terrified as the plane starts to lose its balance. Sully communicates with air traffic control, asking them to clear the runway as quickly as possible. But then, Sully changes his mind, realizing that they won't make it to the runway in time. He decides to land in the river. He instructs all the passengers to buckle their seatbelts and brace for impact. Sully and Jeff begin their descent toward the river. We return to the present. Sully ends the call with his wife Lauren and heads out to the streets for a run. As he jogs past an aircraft carrier, he recalls his days as a fighter pilot skilled in flying fighter jets. We notice that the plane on the carrier is the same model Sully used to fly. Though, to be honest, I might disagree with director Clint Eastwood here, since that old plane probably got destroyed in the Iraq War. Sully ends the day at a local bar, where he's surprised to find that everyone knows who he is, and they all greet him as a hero in their eyes. Sully then drifts back into memory, back to the day of the incident. After Sully lands in the river, the passengers are in sheer terror, thinking they're going to die. But Sully successfully lands the plane and all the passengers are safe. Sully exits the cockpit and instructs all passengers to put on their life jackets and exit the plane immediately. The life rafts are ready for the passengers, and they float in the river for a few moments before help arrives. Everyone boards the rescue boats, except Sully, who is the last one to leave the plane to make sure all the passengers are okay. Once Sully is out of the danger zone, he calls his wife to reassure her, even though she has no idea what's happened. He asks her to watch the news, and she'll understand everything. Sully's main concern is the passengers. He goes to the police to ask how many people there are and whether anyone is injured. The police reassure him and tell him to head to the hospital for a checkup. Sully goes to the hospital, still anxious, until his boss, Ernie, shows up and reassures him that all 155 passengers are fine and well. Sully feels like the weight of the world has been lifted off his chest. When he returns to the hotel, he meets one of the flight attendants who hugs him and thanks him, saying that without him, the plane would have crashed into the Statue of Liberty by now. We cut back to the present. Sully is still at the bar, watching the news. Then an idea hits him. He picks up the phone and calls one of the investigators named Michael. He tells him that he wants to reenact the flight himself before the trial. We learn that the investigation board has decided to use a computer system to simulate the incident and determine whether Sully made a mistake or not. But Sully wants to do the simulation himself, so he can avoid any potential error that might come from the computer's calculations. He tells Michael that if his results match the computer's, he'll personally file for retirement. Michael agrees, telling him that he'll try to help Sully with his request as much as he can. Before the trial, Lauren calls Sully crying. She tells him she hasn't really been there for him, but she understands that being on that plane during the incident must have affected him deeply. Sully arrives at the courtroom with Jeff. Charles enters and announces that they've agreed to let Sully reenact the incident himself before the trial. The simulation will use the same plane and the same weather conditions as the day of the crash. During the reenactment, they bring in two pilots who immediately head towards the runway after the bird strike, landing the plane safely. Then they run the simulation again, but this time at a different airport. The result is the same, they land safely. Charles is surprised and asks Sully what he's trying to prove with this human reenactment. Sully tells him that the simulation didn't include the most crucial factor, the presence of the passengers. None of the pilots in the reenactment were under the same pressure he was because they weren't trying to ensure the survival of the passengers. He then asks them about the simulation process and how many attempts were made to get it right. The flight engineer tells him that one of the pilots had to make 17 attempts just to get one right. Sully also points out that in the reenactment, the pilots didn't wait for the critical decision time from air traffic control after the engine failure. They acted immediately, whereas the real pilots had to wait for 35 seconds to make a decision. Charles agrees to run the simulation again, instructing the pilots to wait 35 seconds after the bird strike before attempting to head towards the airport. This time, the pilots fail to land and the plane crashes in the city, creating a disaster in the simulation system. Everyone is stunned, and they ask Sully to explain what he did in reality. Of course, what Sully did was recorded in the plane's black box, and everyone listens to it. After the session, Sully leaves with Jeff and tells him he's proud of what they did. No matter what the court decides, it doesn't change the fact that they saved 155 lives. After a while, everyone returns to the courtroom to hear the verdict. The flight engineer informs them that they recovered the second engine from the river, and it was indeed damaged and not operational. After listening to the black box recording, it's proven that Sully and Jeff made the right decisions, and that what could have been a minor incident could have turned into a massive catastrophe if not for Sully's actions. But Sully interrupts her, saying that Jeff and the entire crew also played a vital role in what happened, and that they're just as much heroes as he is. And with that, we reach the end of our movie. Unlike Castaway, this film is based on a true story.